This podcast is Challenging Opinions and is presented by William Campbell.
Thank you for downloading the Challenging Opinions podcast for September 3rd, 2018. Things aren't like they used to be in the old days. I know that's true because it's carved in the pyramids. In this show, I talk to a veteran of the 1960s anti-war protests about what that was like then and what he thinks of young people today.
Challenging Opinions is the podcast where ideas are tested. Whether you are left or right, conservative or progressive, devout or skeptic. What matters is the strength of your argument, not the strength of your voice.
And coming up for you in this podcast,
it became clear that what we were doing was so offensive, killing innocent people and the rest of it, that you just turned against it. You did. It was part of what you felt.
On the line now, I have Dave Lefcourt. He's an author. He's also a journalist. And Dave, you wrote an article a while back saying that the American people are incurious. And you said with the smartphone revolution, people are transfixed with their electronic gadgets and they're not curious about what is going on in the world around them, and particularly not curious about what the government is doing. Do you think that's really true?
Well, I believe it's so. The way I see it, I travel around the country. I've been to this past year, to not only where I live in the Middle Atlantic, but up in the Northeast, down into the South, into Florida, the Midwest, the upper Northwest in Seattle. And what I see is these people, like you say, transfixed on their cell phone. I'm not sure what it is, but and then overhearing conversations. I travel a lot on public transportation, and sometimes, it's not that you're intent on listening to conversations, but you overhear things where you're seated, let's say on a train or whatever, and the conversation is such that it has nothing to do with what's going on in the world. And I think I don't know if it was the intent of the government or deep state, whatever, to come up with the smartphone, but I'll tell you, it is one of the great, how do you put it, distractions away from what they do. I mean, what the United States is doing all over the world with these undeclared wars, whether it be in Iraq, which was totally unforgiving. I mean, there was no basis for it. I had read, for instance, Scott Ritter, who was a nuclear inspector in the 90s after the Gulf War. And he said that his group had gone throughout the country and there was no weapons of mass destruction. Now, the idea that the Congress didn't know anything about this, or I was only privy to it. Come on, I mean, it was known that that this had happened.
Let me pause you on that for a second, Dave, and I understand what you're saying, and I know that you're a retired gentleman, so let me just defend the youth a little bit. I think it's always been true that older people have talked about how disappointed they are in the youth and how the youth of today it's nothing like when I was a kid. Isn't it a little bit unfair? But that there's some very sharp metrics. For example, subscriptions to things like the New York Times online, which people read on their smartphone, are going way up. Yeah, for sure, there were always some people who were interested in current affairs, but there was always a huge mass of the population who had very little interest, if any, and now we have universal literacy. We have people have pretty much the entire population have all information available to them through the internet. And for sure, some people use that to go on dating apps or to go and play Candy Crush or some other games. But really, a lot of people are interested, and young people, a large number of them, are getting involved in politics, be it involved in political parties or in single issue campaigns. Aren't you being an old curmudgeon there?
You've got a point there, but I go back to the time of the Vietnam War, especially I would say from '67. Well, that's when it really turned with me. That the war was wrong, that the government, what it was doing in bombing North Vietnam and the rest of it, and there was huge demonstrations all over the country on campuses and everything. Well, that was the time of the universal draft. You don't have a draft today, and it was intended after, I believe, in 1973, after we got out of the war in Vietnam. That they dropped the draft. That the Congress realized, whoa, they didn't want this kind of eruption happening again. And if they had an all volunteer force, it wouldn't happen. And this is what I believe has happened today. I remember prior to the invasion of Iraq by Bush that there was some demonstrations, and they were fairly large, even all across the world. But they weren't sustained like the ones that we had in the 60s and early 70s. I mean, I was on campus at the time in grad school, and it was immense the way it was. I mean, and you think about
give people a word picture. So, Dave, you've got a lot more experience in life than a lot of people listening to this podcast. Give people a word picture about what it was like to be around in 1968, 1967, 1969 on campus.
Oh my gosh! I mean, on my campus, which was the University of Maryland, I mean, we were on it was like, I would say thousands, maybe 5,000 on the lawn at the University of Maryland, and we were waiting to meet up with people that were marching from American University down University Boulevard, and it was going to be a big gathering together. And it was a sense that we were changing the world. That's how you felt at the time. Now, I was in my 20s at the time, or late 20s anyway. So you got a sense that you were part of something that was changing the world. And significantly, what happened? Johnson, the president, decided not to run in 1968, and a good part of that was because of the demonstrations that were occurring at that time. I think that would be unimaginable today to put that kind of pressure on a president to consider not running for re-election.
There are some people imagining putting that pressure on a president right now. I can tell you whether they'll succeed or not is a different question entirely. Tell me, in the 60s, I think one of the things that created, you might know this better than me, but I think one of the things that created this radicalism on campus was that it was the first time that there was mass access to higher education. Before, that was really reserved to the elite. Do you think that was part of what impacted that?
Well, I guess it was mass access, but the country was ready for it. I mean, this wasn't the 50s any longer. I mean, women were beginning to demonstrate. The civil rights movement was very big. Martin Luther King was very significant at the time. There was things that were happening, in the Deep South, and of course, what was happening in California at the University of California at Berkeley, which has really started a lot of the demonstrations against the war and all. So it was a different time. I don't know why. I don't know if universal university education was a significant part of it. I would just know I was a part of it at the time.
What made you a part of it?
Well, maybe a part of it. Well, I had changed significantly from originally being for what Johnson did in 1965, and of course, at the time I didn't know about the Gulf of Tonkin incident and that it was a false flag operation. It became clear that what we were doing was so offensive, killing innocent people and the rest of it, that you just turned against it. You did. It was part of what you felt, and of course, this is also a time of people, embracing the flag and love it or leave it crowd.
These were conservatives supporting the war in Vietnam.
Yes.
But specifically, what made you part of the protest movement and not part of their movement?
Well, I had changed.
What made you change?
What made me change? Well, I guess reading about it, I can't remember the specifics about what I read, what I saw. I mean, the networks at that time, what was shown on TV. You had old Uncle Walter Cronkite as the head of CBS News, and who later turned against the war. But I mean, you saw images of the war. I mean, coffins of Americans dying over there. There was the journalists at the time were not impacted with the military, but they were outside of it. So what was coming across to us from the media was that it was a horror that was going on, and if you honestly saw it, you felt against it. You protested against it. There was others that were in doing the same thing, so you joined it.
And tell me, Dave, you obviously were part of, there was a great feeling of being able to change the world at the time. Were you disappointed with what happened afterwards in the 70s and 80s?
Well, was I disappointed? Well, I think there was some positive things that came about. Because in the early 70s, what happened with Nixon and the Watergate and the rest of it, and you had you saw what he did or the cover up and the rest of it. So, and at the time I was a big subscriber to the Washington Post, and that whole investigation that the Post did was significant, and I followed it, daily. And out of that, there was investigations.
Unfortunately, at that point, Dave's phone line broke down, but I managed to get him back on the phone, and we talked about the change in the way the United States adversaries are viewed by the American left and right since he first got interested in politics. Do you think that, a lot of, in the 1960s, 1970s, a lot of people on the left in the US, like yourself, had sympathy, maybe a sneaking regard for the Soviet Union? That's sort of flipped now, hasn't it?
Oh, well, what's going on today in Russia, I believe, is not the Soviet Union. The idea that Putin is trying to resurrect the Soviet Union, I believe, is nonsense. That's my opinion. But
from the point of view, Dave, from the point of view of an authoritarian state, he is trying to, economic policies aside.
Well, he was elected by the Russian people. Now you can, and as far as I know, the election was legitimate. Whether Jimmy Carter was
now, Dave, come on, there was huge.
You don't think that's true?
I absolutely don't. But tell me your opinion of him anyway.
Well, I believe he was elected freely by the Russian people. That's my belief. But what happened with Russia and the Soviet Union after the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991 throughout the 90s, it was disastrous for Russia. I mean, people who were retired, their pensions were reduced. It was a really serious, terrible economic situation in Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed. Now, when Putin came into power, I believe, from Yeltsin, I think in 2001, I think he set in mind that Russia was going to, get its sovereignty back and get its integrity back, and I believe in many ways he's done that. There was an agreement with Gorbachev and the Bush senior administration that NATO would not move 1 inch eastward if the Soviet Union at the time would allow Germany, the two Germanys, to combine, and that was a verbal agreement which Clinton in the early 1990s abrogated, and then with the expansion of NATO to the borders of Russia, with some of the old satellites that became independent countries, the Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria. I can't remember the sequence in terms of the expansion, but right now, I mean, my gosh, NATO is basically at the doorstep of Russia, and it's gonna, and that whole agreement is just completely ignored and disregarded.
And do you think that people who, and I want to focus back on the contrast between activists, maybe from the 1960s and 70s like yourself, and people today, do you think that, and there's been, I'm sure you've seen online, a huge amount of criticism particularly of left-wing activists, and whether they believe in free speech sufficiently strongly, and whether the issues that they're focusing on. But in the 60s, for all its idealism and for all its qualities, there was a lot wrong then as well. And for example, the treatment of women in activist movements left nothing to, there was nothing to be proud of there. And do you think possibly that maybe some of the subsequent generations have done better, have got it right compared to the 60s?
They have. I mean, I'll admit that my consciousness was raised from the time in the 60s to where it is now. I mean, we were doing things unconsciously, referring to women as girls and maybe derogatory comments that we weren't even aware of. So in terms of women, I think there's a definite consciousness raising from that time, but we had to learn. And I think, especially on the left, I believe it has grown to where it's much more open and accepting, and the idea of women's equality. I mean, I look at women's sports, for instance. I mean, prior to Title IX in 1972, I believe. I mean, women's sports didn't hardly exist. Now today, my God, it's flowering. I think it's great. I think it's stupendous. In fact, so there's definitely positive things.
If you had, Dave, to give one piece of advice to somebody who's maybe 18 or 19 years old, going to college for the first time, who was politically interested but didn't know what to do about it, what advice would you give them?
Well, keep an open mind, go to alternative news sites, and don't believe everything that you hear and read on the mainstream media, and make up your own mind, and reflect on what you're reading, and then maybe just be open-minded. That's significantly, I think, that I would suggest.
Are you optimistic for the future?
Am I optimistic for the future? Yes, but I don't know. My optimism with the United States is not that great. I mean, what I see is, economic development coming from the East from China and its Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, the expansion there, I think is significant. I just wonder about the future for kids growing up in this country. I see the demise of the middle class in many instances. Jobs are not that plentiful. Jobs have been shipped overseas. So I don't know. I'm having difficulty with the United States, and I was born here, but I just don't get the sense that we're heading in the right direction. I don't think our government is in the right direction. I don't think it's supportive of the people. I mean, Trump is. You never know what Trump is going to be. I mean, he talks about ending jobs and this and that, and then he puts sanctions on people and trade sanctions and the rest of it. I just have difficulty with what's going on politically in this country. So,
Dave Lefcourt, thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you, William. Thank you a lot.
Never miss a show. You can subscribe to the podcast for free using iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, or any other podcast software or app. See challengingopinions.com/subscribe for details.
Go to the website for sources and links to what we were talking about. And while you're there, please like the show on Facebook, follow @ChallengingO on Twitter, and get in touch with me if you can suggest a guest or topic for a future show. Also, you can find out how to subscribe to the podcast for free on your computer, on your phone, or by email. It's all at www.challengingopinions.com. And I now also have a Patreon account. Thanks to the people who signed up as patrons so far. I really appreciate that. It means that I can devote more time to research and to finding interesting guests. And if you could do the same as them and sign up as a patron, you'll find all the details on the website. I'd really appreciate that. The Challenging Opinions podcast is produced and presented by me, William Campbell. Thank you for listening.